This should be the last of the lectures on the problem of evil. I think this is the third one. We start out with just the straightforward problem itself. I'm going to go over a few things that we did before just to reinforce them a little bit for you. If God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, why does evil exist? Okay, and J.L. Mackie, I asked you to read J.L. Mackie. His work in theory of religion is really just a sideline. He was a very logical, skeptical kind of a person, and this was just him, I guess his version of flame mail, really, where he's going off about something he really feels strongly about. But so God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. So these are the two changes that Mackie makes to the argument where he defines good. Good is opposed to evil, i.e. a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, and that there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. He wants to head off right here sort of the paradox of omnipotence and concerns about maybe there's limitations on omnipotence. He's just not going to buy it. If there's limitations on God's power, then he's not God. Okay, so remember there's adequate solutions to this. The first one is to question God's goodness and just say, well, maybe God's not all good. And if God is not all good, then there is no problem of evil. That's simple. But nobody really accepts this. This is not considered to be a very persuasive argument because if God is not all good, then God doesn't deserve worship. And, this is one of, the most important categories. Second one, coming to us from Averroes, from Aristotle via Averroes and Aquinas, the omnipotence may not mean what we think it does, right? So we have the paradox of omnipotence. Maybe God isn't all-powerful, or isn't all-powerful in the way we think God is. Can God truly do everything? Well, we can make some noises, apparently. Can God create a rock so big that God cannot lift it? If God can, then there's a rock that is beyond God's own power. If God cannot, then there's something that God can't do. And Thomas Aquinas breaks it down to God can do all things that are possible. So the second of the adequate solutions is to question omnipotence. There are some, the ability to question, what constitutes evil. We'll look at that a little bit further down. Gottfried Leibniz, this is the best of all possible worlds, kind of by definition. He's not saying it's a nice world. But this, in an odd kind of way, just sort of seals the fate of the optimist argument that this is the best of all possible worlds, the disaster at Lisbon. Because there's just too many easy ways to imagine that God could have fixed things that don't seem to interfere with something else. Okay. Then we get into the greater good. Maybe evil exists because some evil is necessary to achieve some greater good that's really, really powerful. And we cannot achieve it without some suffering and evil. J.L. Mackie calls these secondary goods, or secondary virtues. Suffering and evil is needed to help people achieve their potential. And this is easy to imagine, right? If you're going to become as strong as you can, become as smart as you can, become as kind as you can, you have to have experiences that make you use your strength, in which you can use your wisdom, in which you can see the need for and express your compassion, right? If we aren't challenged, then we never really grow in a whole lot of ways. And J.L. Mackie, among others, notes that there are certain kinds of qualities that we usually think are very, very good that we can't have at all if evil does not exist or suffering in some way. The two big examples are heroism and compassion. You have to be challenged, right? You have to be afraid of something and need to stand up to it, at risk to yourself or something else that you care about, in order to demonstrate heroism. And that can't exist unless there's some, real experience of risk going on, in a situation. Compassion requires suffering in order for it to be expressed as a virtue. You can't really have compassion for somebody who's having a perfectly good life. There's no need for it. There's no anything for it. It would not exist at all, assuming that the world was perfectly good. I think it's interesting to try and imagine what would a world without evil and suffering look like. All right, so Mackie says, though, the thing that you have to recognize is that there are second-order evils that come about because we have this possibility of heroism. We have this possibility of heroism failing, and we have, cowardice. Cowardice is not possible unless there is suffering unless there's fear. And if fear is there, heroism is possible. But if heroism is possible, we can also give in to the fear and experience cowardice. Compassion, the possibility of compassion also makes it possible that we can turn away from those who need our help and be callous towards them. And I think last time I pointed out to you that Aristotle, when he looks at virtues and vices, he gives us, that there's a virtue, which is sort of the quality that you need to do a particular thing. You need wisdom. But if, I guess you can't really be too wise. That's maybe a wise ass, but no, excuse me. So, right. Yeah, there's particular virtues, like heroism is one, that there's a possibility of both an excess and a deficit of the quality that creates a hero, right? We have the coward who is, suffering from a lack of courage, the deficit, and then we have the person who's foolhardy, who is themselves, doesn't recognize what kind of harm can happen to them and those around them, and they just don't experience fear. They just kind of plunge headlong into everything without really considering the consequences. So J.L. Mackie's point here, right? So if we say that we need some evil and suffering for the greater good, right, then it must be the case that we gain a greater good from this. And he's arguing that for every virtue that is produced, there is a second order evil where the virtue fails. So that there is even numbers, for every virtue, there's going to be a vice. And so we really don't gain any greater evil. The total still remains the same. Okay, so this is probably, I think I started to get into this. Okay, great. So this is thought to be one of the most persuasive of the theodicies, or the arguments that are used to justify the existence of evil and suffering in the world of an all-good, all-powerful God. And there's two parts to it, or two different aspects of it. One is that God did not produce evil in the world. Humans made evil and suffering in the world out of our freedom. Since God never produced the evil, since it was, just us and, our poor little flawed selves, then it doesn't the existence of evil and suffering has nothing to do, doesn't really challenge God's omnibenevolence because God didn't do it. And again, along the lines of, for the greater good, it's assumed here that human beings having free will is a very, very important kind of value. And to really have free will, right, we also have to have the ability to do the wrong thing. Can we be said to be truly free if, we're kind of pre-programmed to always do the right thing? Stephen Law and J.L. Mackie say that God could make us good, right? We could have been naturally made to always do the right thing, right? Maybe choose between good and better rather than good and evil. We could have been made intrinsically good, and we would have acted freely out of this intrinsic goodness that we have to do the right thing always. But I think of a lot of people, it clashes with our intuition, with what free will is kind of about. It doesn't make sense to say that you're both free and not free at the same time, right? You've been made in such a way that you have a predisposition to always, choose the best act. That doesn't seem like, I think, freedom, at least intuitively, to many people. Nevertheless, it's thought to be one of the most persuasive. And again, if it's the case that, I'm thinking back to the Euthyphro, sorry, if it limits God's power to let humans choose evil and thus to cause evil, so also, allowing humans to produce and create evil and suffering in the world, and because it's human created, God doesn't interfere with it, right? It's made out of our own free will. Then it's kind of it's a bit of a break on God's omnipotence. And even if you accept this whole idea of being true, right? Maybe that evil exists so that we can have real free will, right? We have the ability to, wait in line and think about chocolate, vanilla, or stab the person in front of me. And, that makes me, freer than if I could just think about chocolate and vanilla. It doesn't explain natural or non-moral evil. There seems to be, suffering that is created that has nothing to do with nobody, nowhere, no how, no choices, right? Volcanoes, hurricanes, plagues, natural disasters create a lot of suffering. And that has nothing to do with our free will. The people in Lisbon could not have known that they were at risk of a major earthquake. They didn't have the tools or the skills to be able to see local fault lines. There's also another aspect of this that troubles me, at least, which is that also saying that people have to be free to do evil seems to mean that they have to be free to do evil to other people who didn't do anything to deserve it. So, owner of a big factory up the river decides he doesn't want to pay for his toxic waste to be removed by truck, and he just figures, it's nighttime, I'll just let it flow downstream in the river, and that'll save me a lot of money. In the meantime, this person has poisoned everybody and everything that's downstream. And the people that live downstream of the factory, is it really so valuable that that person in the factory has the ability to be free, to make freely bad choices, that it's not only a risk to themselves, not only is it a risk to the nature, the ecology, and so forth. It's a risk to all the living things that are downstream, including other human beings, which presumably we have. There's value for their free will as well. It's kind of being subsumed or subservient to somebody else's free will when they make a choice that affects them without their knowledge or consent. So it doesn't. Nevertheless, Alvin Plantinga has a major defense that's constructed around this idea and believes that this is why there is evil and suffering in the world that has been created and maintained by an all-good, all-powerful God. Okay. Okay. This is following up with that idea of evil as an expression of will, as it being a result of choices. And yeah, here's Mackie and Stephen Law also ask, if God is so powerful, why don't we always choose the right thing? We could have been created in such a way that we always choose the right thing to do. Acrasia is interesting. Is people in ancient Greece, and this was a problem for philosophers, to maybe still to a certain extent. There are times when we know what the right thing is to do, and we choose not to do it anyway. And the ancient Greeks, Socrates and Plato, etc., they believed that if you know what the right thing to do is, you're going to do it, because it sort of is self-justifying in a way, that the right thing to do is, once it becomes obvious, you are to do the right thing. And if you choose not to do the right thing when you know otherwise, you choose not to take the trash out, even though it's starting to smell and annoying other people in the house. The ancient Greeks, they felt like there's something wrong with you. You're sick. So the weakness of the will is a kind of disease. So acrasia, the idea is interesting in this context, with regard to, thinking about what the nature of the weakness of the will really is, and to think about, well, wait a minute, why do we do the wrong thing? And J.L. Mackie, and oh yeah, the other thing about acrasia is you could use it as a kind of excuse every now and then. You could say, why haven't you taken the trash out? And you say, because I'm suffering from acrasia. So we could have been constructed so as to always choose the right thing. And again, like I was just reiterating, it's not clear to me how the existence of free will really justifies the suffering of people who are innocent due to the choices of others. So in order for some people to have free will, for everybody to have free will, they have to be capable of making decisions that not only are, bad for themselves or their own goals and aims and interests, they're bad for other people too. Pretty much everybody kind of downstream of the decision, as it were. So that's my issue. Okay, now this is the other adequate solution, which is redefining evil, saying maybe we're just wrong about what constitutes evil. There is a poet by the name, or was a poet rather, by the name of Alexander Pope. This is not the Pope in Rome or Avignon. Discord is just harmony not understood. So Alexander Pope wrote a famous poem. It's called An Essay on Man, and he uses it to justify the existence of suffering and evil in the universe of an all-good, all-powerful God. And, this is obviously one of the best lines in it. If you've ever played music, played an instrument or sang, produced music basically, through your own means, some of you probably have had this experience will remember when you're first learning a piece, right? You're sitting down, you're starting to practice the piece, and you go through it a note at a time. Da 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 dee 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 dee. And you'll hear a note that doesn't make sense, right? You'll go dee 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 donk. And you go, wait, what? Dee 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 donk. And as you progress through the piece, and you become more fluent with being able to play it as music, you eventually hear that note that sounded like a bonk when you were doing it one piece at a time is now an important part of the overall song and adds to the depth and richness of its emotional capacity or range, and just makes it much more interesting. So Alexander Pope is arguing that the things that we see that are suffering and evil in the universe, if we were able to see them in the whole frame of things, we would see that it's not really evil and suffering. It's actually, part of a much richer kind of tapestry. That it's part of a harmony that we just can't hear because we're human and engaged, within the world itself. So when we experience pain and suffering, it's just a feature that we can't perceive because we are not God. So that's kind of interesting. I put a note here. Humans are too tiny of mind to really understand God's full plan. This is the, God is all-powerful part. The ineffability of God. So there's a concern that I have here with this idea, which is that it seems to me that it's problematic to say that discord is just harmony not understood, that evil and suffering is something we just don't understand against the total picture. Because nevertheless, even if we're mistaken about it actually being evil, we still suffer, right? We still, see evil around us and despair at, sometimes our inability to be able to fix things. And if it's, sometimes I think because it's part of something greater, it's part of a total tableau, that it sort of makes it worse because our suffering then almost becomes meaningless, right? If you could see this from my perspective, you would know that this is really nothing. An example I give for this is thinking about taking a dog to the vet. Dogs are they're fairly smart animals when it comes to some things. But when you take your dog to the vet to have some procedure done on the vet that's going to make them feel better, maybe they have a swollen jaw and a bad tooth, and it's obviously painful. You take them to the vet. You cannot explain to the dog that going to the vet is going to make the animal better. This dog is going to go into the most terrifying place on earth, which probably the whole place to a dog smells like fear. They can smell the fear of all the other dogs that have come through there, and all the other really weird smells associated with medicine and so forth. So, but if you could explain to the dog, hey, I know this is going to suck for a little bit, but you're going to feel a lot better really soon. And that really sore tooth you have is going to go away and get better. So if you could explain that to the dog and you chose not to, that would seem to be morally wrong, right? If you could at least help the dog to see in perspective, that this is part of this ongoing process, the dog would go, okay. And might not, feel and suffer quite so much. So that's one version of it isn't really evil. It could be argued that maybe we already kind of have been told this, right? Because I think, we've been told that there is a life after this one, and we're going to encounter the other people in that life that, we're able to pass on to the afterlife as well, and so on. So that this suffering, is just temporary, and that we will continue to go on. But it's a matter of faith, not logic. The other example, this is really interesting. I haven't heard this used much in the context of the problem of evil, but I think I've had a couple people write their paper off of this. And there's a kind of faith. It's called Christian Science. And the Christian Scientists believe that the disease and suffering that we experience in this world is an illusion. It's illusory. That if we had real faith, we could see through this, flawed vision that lies before us, this veil that lies between us and God's reality. God would only ever create a perfect world. God would not create these other things. These are something we somehow do to ourselves, that we see with our flawed vision. But if we really have faith, we can see that disease and so forth is just an illusion. The Christian Scientists are people, for instance, who don't go to the doctor, and they don't take medicine, and they don't get vaccines, and because it's a sign of a lack of faith in God. And when somebody gets ill, they have a prayer circle over it. You may have read about some of these cases, because it seems like on the one hand, people should to some extent have a right to determine what they can do with their bodies and so forth. But when parents, though, are making decisions for their children, when a child is suffering from something that could easily have been rectified with modern medicine, and the Christian Scientist says, no, we're going to pray, and the child dies or suffers horribly as a consequence, the parents have been held liable in court for that. Okay. All right, this is one of the more famous arguments as well. This is called the comparative argument. Evil is needed to understand good. And this is pretty straightforward. So It's in the same way that, you can't really understand light unless you see shadow, right? You can't, you wouldn't be aware of light at all if there were no shadows. So we need some kind of evil and suffering to help us understand what good is. That we really mostly live in a very good world. And in order to appreciate that, we need a little reminder that things could be much worse. And it's like using hot to understand cold, right? How do we understand this is hot water, this is cold water? You feel the difference between the two. Now, what we've been doing up to this point is really dealing with what we call the excuse me, the logical problem of evil, which is, why does evil exist at all? But there's another problem called the evidentiary problem, and I think Stephen Law talked about this idea, that distinction. Maybe we do need some evil and suffering in the world to get some of these greater goods, whether it be free will, or that we need to be able to understand why things are good, or that things are good, and so on. But to Stephen Law's mind, where he talked about, if God is all good and all powerful, then God would not allow any extra, not one iota, not one tiny bit of evil into the world that wasn't absolutely necessary, right? But it seems to be the case that there's a lot more suffering and evil in the universe than is needed for establishing that we have free will, that we need evil to understand good, in this comparative argument, and so on. So that's the evidentiary problem. To give you an example of this is a famous argument. There's an article by William Rowe, and he gives us this idea called Rowe's fawn, another thought experiment. Rowe describes a fawn, going through the forest, and a wildfire is sparked by a lightning strike, and the fawn is badly burned in the wildfire, can't get away, and suffers horribly and dies. And this would seem to be a great deal of suffering. And there's no human beings, or really nothing, or anybody else who was able to witness this, was to be, inspired to compassion, be, moved by seeing the fawn's suffering. That just didn't happen. That tree fell in the forest, and really nobody did hear it. But the deer's suffering is ultimately meaningless, because it served no purpose whatsoever. And so that, along the lines of the evidentiary problem, that there is a lot of suffering and evil in the world that just can't be justified using these arguments. I take this idea and I twist it a little bit. I talk about maybe the fawn is, instead of dying in a fire, is actually walking through the forest, and a limb falls, and it falls on the top of the fawn, breaks the fawn's back, and paralyzes it. The fawn is going, suffers horribly, and finally from, dehydration, dies a rather grim death. Do we think this kind of thing is real? Do you think this kind of thing happens, where there's animals and even human beings that are separated from other people that suffer terribly, and die, and or not even die, they just suffer terribly, right? because of what? And it serves seemingly no purpose whatsoever. And that we find it so easy, especially I think given, news coverage of the fires on the West Coast, that animals will suffer and die in a wildfire without, any observation whatsoever, any redeeming virtue at all coming from their death. That they died so painfully, in and of itself seems to do nothing. The whole reason I switch it over to a limb falling out of the forest. Imagine, if you will, that maybe God created a small breeze as this fawn is walking through the forest, and made a leaf flicker, maybe in the light that's coming down through the canopy of the trees, and the fawn just hesitates for a second, and that's hesitation is enough that when it walks underneath the tree and the limb falls, instead of falling on the back of the fawn, now it falls on the fawn's head. And the fawn is either rendered unconscious, in which case, it's still going to die of dehydration. It just doesn't have to suffer for it. If there's some purpose to, say, keeping the fawn alive, this is part of God's plan to, provide food for somebody or something that's coming along. The best way to keep it fresh is to keep it alive. Or it could have, just killed the fawn in that moment if, what God thought that God needed was for that fawn to become part of the earth at this point. But it's perfectly believable that these things happen all the time, and that there's just no purpose to it whatsoever. In order to experience fellow feeling for other people, to experience compassion, to achieve our, development of people, is to reinforce relationships with other people, through shared suffering, and overcoming of obstacles and things like this. You don't need as many tornadoes as we've been getting. The wildfires don't need to be, all that really, really huge. So there seems to be a great deal more evil in the world than can be justified. Even if we believe that some evil is justified, it seems like there's a heck of a lot of it. Sometimes I argue that for us also to be able to appreciate what's good, maybe what we need really isn't very much. Maybe, you live a perfectly content and unpainful life until you're, the age of 13, which is usually when they do these kinds of things. And they, take you behind the curtain and whack you in the hand with a hammer and go, doesn't that suck? And you're, yeah, that really hurts. That's awful. They say, yep. So think about all the rest of the time when you haven't hit your head with a hammer, how really good that feels. The best way to make your hand feel better when it's been hit by a hammer is to stop hitting it with the hammer. But, just needs that one very sharp shock of experience. How much experience do you think you really need to understand that most of your life is pretty much without suffering in some sense or another? Okay, I'm going to look at the Stephen Law argument, Schopenhauer, and I think the rest of it y'all can see yourselves. Stephen Law came up with this is why I really wanted you to listen to it. First of all, he does two things. One is that Stephen Law, I think, does a very good job of just describing the problem of evil in general. And I figure if the crash course doesn't do it, if I don't do it, if your reading didn't do it, Stephen Law is going to be able to explain it to you. One of us will make it understandable. I haven't been able to find corresponding, podcasts like that really work with other concepts. The other thing is that he introduces an idea called that comes to be called the Evil God Challenge. I think he calls it the problem of good in the podcast. He later went on to write a major article about the Evil God Challenge. After he produced this podcast, this was I think part of his writing process, as he was writing the paper, doing a presentation about it. And that might be interesting for somebody to write a paper about if they're really so inclined. So Stephen Law says, well, maybe it's the case that God is all evil, right? Maybe we really don't understand God at all. And we've been defining and accepting God as being all good because that's kind of what we think and what we want. But it might be the case that God is in fact an entirely evil entity, and that what we should be doing is, instead of trying to describe, figure out why there's evil in a world that's been created and maintained by an all-good God, we should be trying to figure out why good exists in the universe of an all-evil God. And what Stephen Law wants us to note is that there's this symmetry between the arguments that are used to justify the existence of evil in an all-good world, between those arguments, and uses exactly the same arguments to justify the existence of good in an all-evil universe. Why, we have to have good in our evil universe so that we can truly express our free will to be absolutely terrible, makes our choices more meaningful, knowing that we could have done a nice thing here, that makes the bad thing that we've done so much more terrible, right? We have to have goodness in the world so that the rest of the time, we understand how really bad the suffering is. Maybe it's the other way around. You get hit by a hand and the hammer all the time, and then they pause for a little while. Just you get to feel what it feels like not to be hit in the hand with a hammer. And then they go back to hammering your hand, so you really know how bad it feels. So that's the kind of comparative argument. Let's see. So we got the free will argument, we got the comparative argument. Maybe it's the case that, are we mistaken about what good is? That it's really evil, and if we were able to see everything, that, this one little blip of happiness, or these, this experience of happiness is itself illusory and just part of this greater tableau of suffering. So Stephen Law thinks that since you can use the same arguments to justify the existence of good in an all-evil universe, with an all-evil God, that you can to justify the universe, the argument of presence of evil in the universe of an all-good God, that they're equally likely. There's no reason to believe in an all-good God. There's no better reason for that than an all-evil God. There's, of course, preferences, but logically speaking, if we go through the arguments to justify the existence of evil in an all-good universe, they're just as logical as the arguments used to justify the existence of evil or good in an all-evil universe. So that's kind of an interesting idea that someone might appreciate writing about. Okay, one more thing. Schopenhauer, famous philosopher, I think Arthur Schopenhauer. Is it Arthur? Anyway, not a very happy guy. He recognized the Buddhist claim that, desire is suffering, but kind of withdrew a different consequence from it. He just kind of was a real jerk. Anyway, very pessimistic guy. Schopenhauer says that if it was the case that God wanted to create a universe without suffering, if we wanted to create a world without suffering, then God would have just left the earth as a bare rock. Absent the existence of any life, there's no suffering. So that's just another interesting look at that. This right here is a description of Arthur Schopenhauer's argument. This is also from, Dinosaur Comics. I don't know if any of you have seen these. It's a series of comics that go through exactly the same panels, exactly the same pictures, exactly the same dinosaurs. Got to step on the log cabin, but the conversation is changed every single time. And they did one about Arthur Schopenhauer explaining this. It's just kind of an interesting way to look at it. I recommend either you pause this and read it now, or you look at the PowerPoint later on. And just, for a final note, is this one. This is from the comic, good heavens, The Far Side, sorry. The Far Side by Larson. And it's one of the, it's a very good comic. The guy has recently come out of retirement and been doing a little bit, creating some new comics. But I recommend The Far Side highly if you ever get a chance to read it. So just to make it interesting, this is why there's evil in the world, because it would be a lot more boring without it. Though every now and then I think I could do with a little more boring. Okay, so that is the end of this unit on the problem of evil.